Okay, that's enough of that setup. I was just posting stuff in like my social medias, just to let you guys know that we're live. And today we're reading from the book of Judges. I didn't even do my proper intro that time. That was all. It threw me off in here. I was just like, wait, that's not how I do an intro. Let's try that again, shall we? Hello and welcome to the streaming Parson reads from the book of Judges. Yes, we are doing another book in the Bible, one of the still earlier ones, but we did skip a few of the books because, I didn't want to go through all the law books and because they're honestly a little boring to read. We can be honest about that. And they're definitely not one of the most exciting ones to listen to a guy read to you, right? I mean, maybe some people are like it depends on how you like to have your books, right? Whether you like to actually read it, or like you like to have someone read it to you, like an audiobook kind of thing. But some of the law books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy for sure, they're not the most exciting ones to like read out. So we're gonna skip that. We skip those ones. We skip Numbers as well. Even though there's a lot of like important stuff to talk about, but I kind of didn't want to do the whole Moses story. It's pretty long, but I decided to skip that. We also skipped the book of Joshua, which I will give some context to before I start reading Judges, because Judges comes right after the book of Joshua. So that's kind of where we're at. So we're starting a new reading list, if you will. We're starting from the book of Judges. We'll read a few chapters today. We'll probably only get through about 3 of the Judges, because two of them are like really short, right? So really, more or less, the stream is about one judge and then like a bunch of other crazy, right? So that's kind of the plan for today. If you want to follow along with me, you can open up your Bibles, BibleGateway.com, use Bible app, whatever, right? Free online Bibles, why not use them, right? And you can use that to get to the book of Judges. It goes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and then Judges. Judges is the 7th book of the Bible. But, I mean, if you're using, like, an online Bible, you can just, like, punch it in the search box and boom, Book of Judges, right? And we're starting in chapter 1 because we're starting from the beginning today. I'm going to be using the New International Version if you wish to follow along, and I'll give you a little bit of time to flip to it as I give my preface. But before all that, let's just open up with a word of prayer, shall we? So let's just bow our heads. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read into your word. Thank you for the lovely weekend that we're going to be going into. Some people may have started their weekend already. We just thank you for that. And we just pray that as we read into your word, we pray that you would enlighten us in who we are as people, and more importantly, how we should relate to you. I just pray this in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. Alright, so, the Book of Judges. Basically, if you were to sum this book up in like one sentence, it's basically, crap hit the fan, right? It's like the crazy book, right? Because nothing but crazy happens in this book, right? And there's obviously certain reasons why the Bible tells it this way. This part of Israel's history, like the early Israel history, if you will. But I don't want to get too much into those themes until we get to like very late in the book of Judges, because hopefully you guys will kind of pick it up as we read through the book of Judges, because of course the book of Judges will tell you at the very end anyway what that main theme is. So I mean, if you wanted to cheat, you could just flip to the last chapter of the book of Judges, read it, and then you would know, right? But of course, the way I'm going to go about this is I'm going to take it step by step and say this is kind of what the writers of the book of Judges were trying to get at when they were telling the stories the way that they do, right? Because there's obviously a logic and a rhyme and reason to it, right? Let me just change my lightings for a second here. I'm a little bit too bright. I don't know what you guys see. One of the problems, I mentioned this so many times, but like the relationship between what I see on OBS and what actually is are two very different things. So I might be too bright on OBS, but you might think that once I turn it down and I think it's okay, you might think it's too dark. So just let me know if, something like that happens, right? Whatever. So anyway, continuing on. So with the Book of Judges is, yeah, it's just kind of meant to be like, it just tells you the crazy, right? And one way to look at the Book of Judges, a good way of looking at it, just posting something here. And the social media thing. But one of the things in the Book of Judges that's important to keep in mind is, I'm trying to relate it in a way we can look at the world of 2021. So the Book of Judges, you can actually kind of make this kind of relationship between like what happens in the Book of Judges and, real life today. Is that like, imagine if 100 or 200 years from now, not even that long, right? Because we live in a very different technological age. But let's say in 200 years from now, right? Somebody wanted to look back on what the year, the 21st century was like, right? And they would go through some archives and go through some ancient YouTube videos, assuming YouTube is still a thing in 200 years. But like, they go through some ancient YouTube videos. And basically what the person did was picked all the highlights, all the big events, right? Like stuff like, 21st century had an interesting kickoff with 9/11, right, in 2001. And then you have stuff like a lot of various pandemics. So there was SARS. SARS was roughly at the same time. I remember when I was in the 9th grade, people gave me so much crap when SARS was a thing, because when SARS became the scare, and I was the guy who was coughing in class, right, and everybody freaked out about it. And it was one of those things, right? So, so someone picked up the thing about SARS, right? And then, well, YouTube wasn't even around when SARS and 9/11 were a thing, right? So you might not find that on the YouTube. But then, someone looked up like the birth of Facebook in like 2005, 2006, something like that, right? Birth of Facebook, and that was a pretty big event because of how it changed how social media worked. So, that might be included in archives of what was the 21st century like, right? And then add next big event. What was the next big event of the 21st century? I'm trying to think of like a global event, not just like what was big in my town. Because like in the city where I live in, we had the 2010 Olympics in Vancouver. And Canada, totally kicked ass that year, and they got the most gold medals. And it was a big deal for Vancouver, right? But I wouldn't count that. I'm not going to count that as like a major event of the 21st century. But H1N1 became a thing, right? Or the swine flu. Why is all these bad things, right? But you guys see where I'm going with this, right? So the swine flu was a thing, right? And then, of course, Occupy Wall Street became a thing. And then the first version of Black Lives Matter was in 2012, something like that. Yes, actually, a lot of people may not know that there were actually multiple versions of Black Lives Matter. Because unfortunately, police brutality is a serious problem, right? It happened a whole bunch of times, right? So the first major movement in the black community against, legal authorities like that was that in the 21st century was actually even earlier than 2012. But I was just using 2012 because we would actually have YouTube videos of it. It was a thing. I remember it being a thing. I remember when, 2012 was an interesting year because everybody thought there was a whole Mayan calendar thing, and people thought there was going to be the end of the world then, right? And then, of course, there was the other quote-unquote end of the world earlier in the same year. And it was just like 2012 was just ridiculous, right? So we had like the first version of Black Lives Matters, and then there was people thought the world was going to end in 2012. Didn't. We went in 2013. 2013 was pretty mild. But of course, it was like, I should go back before 2012, right? 2008, we had President Obama, and revolutionary in American history, right? First, black president and everything. And then 2012, people thought the world was going to end. I'm trying to think of other major events in like the early parts of 21st century. So But I wouldn't want to put the Obama thing in like kind of how the Bible would have treated the book of Judges. So the theme I was trying to get at was that basically the book of Judges is treated like all these highlights, right? Throughout a certain section of Israel's history. And that history would be sometime between when Joshua, who was Moses' successor, led the Israelites to take over Canaan. They took over like about half of it, and then they kind of stopped doing the job, and then that ended up coming to bite them in the ass later. But that's besides the point. The point was that basically Israel had moved into the land of Canaan, the promised land, and at that point, Israel was like, all right, things are pretty good. We live in here and the land God promised us. But of course, there's the old saying, right? Bad times lead to strong men lead to good times leads to weak men lead to bad times makes bad men, and that kind of thing, right? So basically, Israel kind of got complacent once they moved into Canaan. To be fair, though, if you were fighting like basically wars for like 12 years after like I don't know, let's say 30 years of walking in the desert, because remember, the people that were moving into the land of Canaan were none of the original people that moved out of Egypt. So I need to kind of fill this time gap for some of you who may not know this. But basically, what happened was Moses and the Israelites, they got screwed up while they were in the desert. They weren't faithful enough. Moses for different reasons, but the Israelites for sure, they weren't faithful enough to God and his promise to bring them to the promised land. And because Israel did not obey God when God said, go in, the victory is yours. The Israelites were too intimidated. They didn't do it. And God said, fine, you want to be that way? Then you guys are going to walk in the desert. And all you original people who walked out of Egypt, you're all going to die. You're going to die out here in the desert. The very thing you feared, because that's, you refuse to listen to me. And so basically, 40 years, the Israelites walked around in circles, basically, in the desert. And then basically, all the original people who left Egypt died, and their children and grandchildren, I guess you could say, would have been the next group of Israel that would move into Canaan. This is basically what the book of Joshua is about, right? That the new Israelites, I guess we could call them, they move into Canaan because they're like, all right, we're going to do this thing, right? We're going to do this thing, we're going to do this thing. And Joshua's like, yeah, I'm going to lead you, we're going to do this thing, right? And they succeed. But of course, after they succeeded, they kind of got complacent. They stopped worshiping God. They started making idols and doing whatever the hell they wanted because they thought they could do whatever they wanted, contrary to what God told them in the law books. You can't do whatever you want because it's bad for your society. And the book of Judges will kind of tell us that, right? Like things kind of crap hit the fan. And basically, how the book of Judges tells it is it picks all these interesting events, right? The highlights, if you will. I mean, to be fair, this is the ancient world. How else do you think they're going to record all this, right? You can't record everything in the ancient world. It'd be impossible, right? We don't have instant, abilities, and we don't have like a quote-unquote infinite space to create documents about everything that was going on, right? Because, us modern people, we have the beauty of the internet. The internet can hold like billions of documents, right, of knowledge. The internet can do that. Whereas back then, that wasn't possible, right? So what they recorded into the book of Judges was kind of like, here are some highlights of some stuff that happened in Israel's history for like roughly 300 years. And the 300 years, give or take, there's some scholar debate of whether it was shorter or longer. The people who say longer, it's about 300 years. The people who say shorter, it's about 150 years. And the reason for this is because when we look at the judges and the stories of these judges, the Bible never tells us whether any of them overlap or any of them happen at the same time. The Bible never tells us this. So the 300 years between Joshua and King Saul is in the camp of the judges happened one after another. Each story fits within a timeline of like this guy happened, he died, and then the next guy came along. As opposed to if you're in the shorter time frame of about 120 to 150 years, is the camp of Bible scholars who believe that the stories told in Judges, a lot of them do overlap, right? Because there's no reason to say that they couldn't, because a lot of them don't even happen in the same place. And that's where some people think that they could have overlapped, because, you know, this is the ancient world. The world is big enough, right? Two of these events could have been happening at the same time, and nobody would have known that, right? At least back then. But, you know, once you compile all the documents, and this is where a lot of Bible scholars talk about how the book of Judges was likely written a lot later. Many people have theories that Samuel, a guy who has a book named after him later in the Bible, the prophet Samuel may have written the book of Judges sometime after, obviously, because Samuel would have been a lot later. Samuel is the end of the age of the Judges, which is whether the 120 or the 300 years, right? And Samuel is at the end of that. But many Bible scholars believe that Samuel more than likely compiled what we call the book of Judges. He didn't write it exactly, but he compiled what we call the book of Judges. And so that's a very popular theory, actually. A lot of Bible scholars go like, yeah, that makes sense. And the reasoning behind why they thought Samuel would have compiled the book of Judges was because Samuel is in fact the end of the age of Samuel is the end of the age of Judges. The book of Samuel will go more into this, but not particularly relevant right now. But basically the idea was that as Samuel was the final judge, more or less, of Israel. I mean, there were a couple after him, but they weren't that important. But basically Samuel was at the end of the age of Judges, so maybe he felt the need to compile all these records of the judges of Israel during this dark period in their history. And of course, there's the other thing about how, like, there's a contrast to the age of the judges compared to the beginning of the age of kings, which is another, like, 400 some odd years, right? Because the age of kings, well, no, it wouldn't be, well, about 400 years, right? And the age of kings would have gone from, like, roughly 1000 BC to the fall of Israel and Judea in like 700 BC. So, like, the age of kings would have been, let's say, yeah, the age of kings would have been about 300 some odd years, right? Between 1000 BC and like 700 something, or like around the end of the 6th century BC, where Israel is actually defeated by the Babylonians. And then the Persians show up shortly after that, right? And the Persians take over the world. But anyway, that's besides the point. The reason why I give all this exposition now is because as we read through the book of Judges and we see how crazy the world of the book of Judges is, there's always something important to keep in mind, is that the book of Judges is not truly indicative of how the world actually was. Which is weird to say, because like people say, well, but the Bible says that this is how things were. But at the same time, what the Bible also says is, you know, these are events that happened when people were godless, right? So on the one hand, yeah, you know, like, I guess you could say most of this part of Israel's history was like this. But at the same time, the Bible, when you read this part of the Bible, you have to understand that, like, the Bible is telling you these major events as taking the extreme examples, if you will, of what happens when, you know, people don't obey God, right? Because you can think of, like, and this, I know it may be a bit of a disservice for me to skip like a lot of the law books, but sure, there was stuff in the law books that people violated and things got worse for Israel, but the Bible never tells us people did this, right? There's lots of other documents, ancient world documents, where people there's a good suggestion that these things might have happened, but there's not enough concrete evidence, one, and two, the Bible didn't feel the need to tell all those smaller details. It wanted to tell the big events, because there's also another theme going in about how Israel the people of Israel by disobeying God, when God basically tells them later on that you are going to get conquered, and when that happens, don't come crying to me, God gives that kind of theme in the story, right? Whereas like the smaller stuff, it wouldn't be serious enough for God to really say that to the Israelites. But with these bigger events, you can kind of see that God kind of has this, you want to play hardball? I play hardball, right? And so that's kind of what ends up happening. But you'll kind of see that as we go along the stories, right? Because all these judges' stories have this theme play along with it. I'm just giving you an overview of that theme, and we will talk about aspects of that as we read through the book of Judges and the different judges and even other crazy ass events that happen, right? So, with that being said, though, the book of Judges, I don't know if I have to give like a like a discretion thing, like, oh yeah, we're gonna talk, like there's gonna be like major themes of like violence more than other books in the Bible. There'll be sexual content in the book of Judges a lot more than other parts of the Bible, right? But I don't know if I need to do this for every stream. Maybe I will have to, but like, warning, content is 18 plus, right? We're reading the rated R parts of the Bible. There's your warning. All right, let's begin. Chapter 1. So after the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, so who of us is to go up and first fight against the Canaanites? And the Lord answered them, well, Judah shall go up. I have given the land into their hands. The men of Judah said to the Simeonites, their fellow Israelites, now come up with us into the territory allotted to us to fight against the Canaanites. We in turn will go with you into yours. So the Simeonites went with them. Now when Judah attacked, the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands. And they struck down 10,000 of men at Bezek. I think that's how you say that. It was there that they found Adoni-Bezek. I think that's how you say it. Adoni-Bezek. And fought against him. Let's turn this off so I'm not glowing as much. Okay, I'm going to read that again. Verse 5. I lost my spot there for a second. It was there that they fought Adoni-Bezek and fought against him, putting to rout the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adoni-Bezek fled, but they chased him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. Damn. We're in chapter 1 and it's already getting pretty bloody. And pretty graphic about it too. Then Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off have picked up scraps under my table. Now God has paid me back for what I did to them. So they brought him to Jerusalem, and Bezek died there. Now the men of Judah attacked Jerusalem also, and they took it. They put the city to the sword, and they set it on fire. So after that, Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites, living in the hill country, the Negev, and the western foothills. They advanced against the Canaanites living in Hebron, formerly called Kiriath Arba, and defeated Shishai, Ahiman, and Talmai. I don't know why I said it that way. From that day, they advanced against the people living in Debir, formerly known as Kiriath Sephir. And Caleb said, I will give my daughter Aska in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiriath Sephir. So Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it. So Caleb gave his daughter Aksa to him in marriage. One day when she came to Othniel, she urged him to ask her father for a field. When she got off her donkey, Caleb asked her, what can I do for you? So she replied, do me a special I'm not doing a voice for her. Do me a special favor, since you have given me land in the Negev. Give me also springs of water. So Caleb gave her the upper and lower springs. The descendants of Moses' father-in-law, the Kenite, went up from the city of palms, with the people of Judah to live among the inhabitants of the desert of Judah in the Negev near Arad. Then the men of Judah went with the Simeonites, their fellow Israelites, and attacked the Canaanites living in Zephath, and they totally destroyed the city. Therefore it was called Hormah. Now Judah also took Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron, each city with its territory. The Lord was with the men of Judah. They took possession of the hill country, and they were unable to drive the people from the plains, because they had chariots fitted with iron. As Moses had promised, Hebron was given to Caleb, who drove from it the 3 sons of Anak. Now the Benjamites, however, did not drive out the Jebusites, who were living in Jerusalem. To this day, the Jebusites live with the Benjamites. Now the tribes of Joseph attacked Bethel, and the Lord was with them. More than one guy. When they sent men to spy out Bethel, formerly called Luz, the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, "Show us how to get into the city, and we will see that you are treated well." So he showed them, and they put the city to the sword, but they spared the man and his family. He then went to the land of the Hittites, where he built a city and called it Luz, which is its name to this day. But Manasseh did not drive out the people of Bethshan or Tanakh or Dor or Ibleam or Megiddo and their surrounding settlements. For the Canaanites were determined to live in that land. When Israel became strong, they pressed the Canaanites into forced labor, but never drove them out completely. Nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites living in Gezer, but the Canaanites continued to live there among them. Neither did Zebulun drive out the Canaanites living in Kitron or Nahalal, so these Canaanites lived among them. But Zebulun did subject them to forced labor. The people of Asher did not drive out those living in Akko or Sidon or Elab or Akzib or Helba or Aphek or Rehob. Oh man, gotta love these tough names to pronounce, right? And then the Asherites lived among the Canaanites because they did not drive them out. Neither did Naphtali drive out those living in Beth Shemesh or Beth Anath, but the Naphtalites too lived among the Canaanite inhabitants of the land, and those living in Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath became forced laborers for them. The Amorites confined the Danites to the hill country, not allowing them to come down into the plain, and the Amorites were determined also to hold out in Mount Heresh, Aijalon and Shalbim. I think that's how you pronounce that. But when the power of the tribes of Joseph increased, they were too pressed into forced labor. The boundary of the Amorites was from Scorpion Pass to Selah and beyond. Oh, now my ear is actually starting to hurt for a second for a weird reason. Like right here. It happens from time to time. So that's why I was like straining to read for a second, because like this pain just started coming up in here. Anyway, so Judges 1, right? Just a continuation of where the book of Joshua left off. So I don't know if I should whip up a map for this, but basically whip up a map for yourself. Honestly, I don't feel like doing it, of the land of Israel. And basically when Joshua was doing his conquest in the book of Joshua. They conquered a lot of the southern part, which was later called Judea. And then they were supposed to keep moving north and conquer all the northern parts of Israel. But as you see in Judges 1, when they were supposed to do that, they didn't do that all that much, right? And you see these tribes like the tribe of Zebulun, the tribe of Naphtali, they kind of like, we're kind of tired of killing people, so let's just like subjugate them and have them as forced laborers. Which, on the one hand, seems like the more compassionate move. You don't just want to go and kill every last one of them. But at the same time, God warned them back in Joshua, I guess you could say. I think it was even earlier. When the book of Joshua, the Israelites were warned that if they didn't kill off the Canaanites, then the Canaanites would lead the Israelites to stop worshiping God. And so it's kind of one of those things where a lot of people have debates about these kind of things, about whether, like, is God actually loving because he ordered the Israelites to kill all the Canaanites? And then people would talk about how, like, well, why didn't God give the Canaanites a chance? Which that's a really dumb question, because he actually kind of does. But we just never see it, right? Because once again, this is where, when you look at the book of Judges, you have to look at it as like Israel news highlights, as opposed to like a more indicative, direct look of the ancient world, right? It's like if, as I used earlier, we only talk about like all the communist regimes as the summary of the 20th century, right? Well, it was the USSR, it was Nazi Germany, right? And stuff like that. Well, those were the big events of, you know, the 20th century. And imagine if someone in the future looked at that and said, that was how the world was back then, right? The world was all these communists and Nazis back in the 20th century, which was not true, right? Because people fought freaking like 5 wars over this, right? So, but then imagine if we ignored those parts, right? That people fought against this, but thought that, well, no, the 20th century was actually just all these Nazis and communists running around, right? But that's not really indicative of how the 20th century actually was. In the same way, it would be unfair for us to look at the book of Judges, because once again, the other thing you have to remember is that this is primarily told from the Jewish perspective, right? So when people say, well, how come God was so quick to just kill all the Canaanites? Did he not give them a chance? It's more than well implied that God did, and the book of Genesis actually implied this a little bit. I mentioned it when we were closing the book of Genesis, and when the Israelites had to live in Egypt for a long time, God was like, I'm going to prepare the land, right, for you to return. And so some people may simply take a very flat interpretation and just say, well, God was going to um, just wait a long time and then let Israel kill them later, which is kind of stupid. Like, why would God wait 400 years to do that, right? So more than likely what the case was, God maybe sent prophets or something, priests or whatever, guys like the Midianites or whatever, to try and convert the people. But maybe, the more than likely that failed, right? And then, so with that being said, 400 years later, God was like, okay, I'm done with you guys. I gave you guys your chance. Now I'm gonna have to kill you guys because you refuse, right? So that's more than likely the case of why God allowed the Israelites to kill all the Canaanites, right? Because maybe they already had their chance and God gave them their chance, but they just refused to. But of course, the other problem we run into is that Israel just doesn't do it, right? They don't do what God told them to do. And so we read here in Judges 1 that that's exactly what happened, right? All these tribes, they just let the Canaanites live with them. Sure, they made them like slaves and stuff, but they didn't kill them, right? But God did warn them, and you can check the book of Deuteronomy for this and the book of Joshua, that by not doing this, the Israelites put themselves at risk for the Canaanites to lead them away from God. And minor / major spoilers, but let's be real, it's not that much of a spoiler. You know exactly where this is going. Is it really a spoiler if you know exactly what's going to happen next? But basically, yeah, what God warned them about, it's exactly what happens, right? Moses warned you, and Joshua will later warn the Israelites. And so it's one of those things when it's kind of a touchy situation when we talk about like when God wanted the Israelites to kill all the Canaanites, because it seems like, oh, you know, like God's apparently genocidal. But on the other hand, it's like, one, they had their chance, and two, God did not want to make other risk for the new inhabitants, right? Who he was going to let the Israelites be the new inhabitants of Canaan. He wanted them to have as little risk as possible, but Israel basically ignored that and put themselves at high risk, right? And yes, we know it's going to come and bite them in the ass because that's how it always is. Anyway, there's not much else to talk about with Judges 1, because the rest of it is just details about like who went where, who fought who, right? And that's kind of how we look at history in general, right? We just look at the big, like, this guy fought this guy, right? And it's usually like a big deal. But anyway, that's Judges 1. Let's move on to Judges 2. The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochum and said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land I swore to give to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land, but you shall break down their altars. Yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? And I also said, I will not drive them out before you. They will become traps for you, and their gods will become snares for you. When the angel of the Lord had spoken these things to all the Israelites, the people wept aloud, and they called that place Bochum. Bochum means weepers, apparently. There they offered sacrifices to the Lord. So after Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each to their own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him, and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Now Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. And they buried him in the land of his inheritance, at Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gosh. So after the whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. And they aroused the Lord's anger, because they forsook him, and they served Baal and Ashereth. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the land of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them, and they were in great distress. And the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. The people quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, He was the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies, as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to the ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshipping them. The people refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. So therefore the Lord was very angry with them and said, because this nation has violated the covenant I ordained for their ancestors and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord, and walk in it as their ancestors did. The Lord had allowed those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua. Alright, so chapter 2. So chapter 2 would be the chapter that basically kind of gives the indicative, this is what the everyday, life of Israel was going to be like, right? And the idea that they gave was, after the older generation died, subsequent generations, they kind of stopped caring about, God and, what God did for their ancestors and whatever, right? Or their parents even, because this is the next generation, right? Basically, the Bible says in one generation, everything, went south. Which is this is an interesting thing that we should study, right? When the book of Judges talks about, like, it only took one generation, right? And, you're ready for the hot take of the week? I'm sure you guys missed these, right? Hot take of the week. We see something very similar in the world today, right? Now, of course, no generation is perfect, so... But even with that said, it's safe to say that not my parents' generation, I'm gonna call it out right now. Not my parents' generation, which my parents would have been like the late baby boomers. But like my parents were born when just before the 60s. Before them, the generation that fought World War II basically and lived during that time. They would have been like a more quote unquote upright generation. I mentioned earlier when, some people may think, like, you look back in the 20th century and you see all this like communism and stuff, right? Well, my grandparents' generation, though not my grandparents personally, but my grandparents' generation, people alive, the really old people now, right? The old war veterans that are over like 80 something, approaching their 90s, right? These guys that were around, during the World War II at least, it's... I know a lot of people disagree with me on this one, but they were a much more upright generation than my parents' generation for sure, and my generation. Now, I say that now I'm going to put an asterisk next to my generation, because first of all, the Zennials is such a big range. I don't know what these stat guys are doing. You can't say that 40 years is like an entire age group. So basically, when we talk about Zennials, I can be put in the same bucket as someone who's like 50 right now, right? And he is in my generation, right? Of course, nowadays, because people have kids later and stuff like that, things like how we define generations kind of warped, right? So, like, okay, my generation ranges from someone who's 50 to about... see, this is where it gets messed up. I can't even say it. It might even be older than 50. It might be like... the way that some people define Zennials and my generation, my parents count as my generation. And some people, in some of these stat guys, right? They talk about like, well, people born in like the 60s. Well, my parents were born just before the 60s, right? So I guess they're close enough. But people around my parents' age and myself would be counted in the same generation, which is kind of weird to think about. But See, that's why I put my generation in asterisk. But when I talk my generation, I talk about like people like in their early 30s, right? And you know, going back to my earlier statement, the older generation, my grandparents' generation, they were a lot more upright than my parents' generation for sure, and my generation. And when I read the book of Judges, it's like, yeah, that's definitely true because like, you know, I can make easy comparisons, right? With like, the generation that fought against tyranny, right? And that was my grandparents' generation. Once again, not my grandparents specifically. My grandparents were people who were saved, if you will, by, you know, freedom fighters and people who fought against tyranny, right? Because, my grandparents were basically uh, Chinese farmers who got their land stolen by the communist regime, right? Of communist China. And basically, my grandparents were like, we're getting the hell out of here, right? And that's why they came to Canada. So they're like, we're getting the hell out of China because it sucks. And so they were able to come to a place like Canada and, places like in the US as well, because there were a lot of people who were fighting against things like communist regimes, right? And that's why there were so many ridiculous wars during the 20th century. The 20th century. What a brain fart! I'm like, what century? But anyway, in the 20th century, right? So my grandparents' generation had people who fought against those kind of things, right? Things like tyranny, and that's why there were so many battles against communism. So I could easily make like a equivalency between my grandparents' generation and then like Joshua's generation, as they were talking about in the Bible, right? Or the generation that Joshua worked with, because Joshua would have been a lot older than them. Once again, the generation thing is weird, right? So anyway, the generation that was faithful to God, and they were the ones fighting, and conquering Canaan, and what would later become Israel, right? But it's funny in Judges 2, it immediately brings up to the next generation. They forgot. They didn't know God or what He'd done for the people. Is how the Bible words it, right? They had not cared about it, right? And the funny thing is, like, I'm easily gonna make a comparison with my parents' generation. So my parents are part of the baby boomer generation, right? And of course, the baby boomers, a lot of them would have been growing up during, the 1960s, right? The 60s, you know, the 60s was actually, contrary to popular belief, it was actually a really dark part of human history, the 1960s. And I'll tell you why. Now, of course, I'm sure there's a lot of people who have made very opposite opinions. But basically, in the same way the book of Judges describes, like, the Israelites just started doing whatever the hell they wanted, that's what the 1960s happened. That's what happened in the 1960s. People just started thinking, well, we could just do whatever we want, right? Now, on paper, that sounds like nice, right? I can do what I want. Nobody can tell me what to do, and I want to be happy, right? And so to be happy, I want to do what I want. But once again, whether even though that sounds nice on a personal level, in reality, that's not good for our society. You can't have a society of people who just think they can do whatever they want. But that was exactly what the 1960s started to promote, right? The 1960s started promoting this idea that, nah, man, we don't need to, um, worry about society at large. Society at large is fine, right? We can just do whatever we want, right? And this is where you get like, the hippie movement that's all like, you know, more drugs, free sex, right? Those kind of things. And once again, on paper, like, sure, it sounds nice. You can do whatever you want, right? If no one has to tell me I can't do marijuana or whatever and stuff like that. Like, oh, people can't tell me that I can have that I can't have sex with whoever I want, right? That was kind of how the 60s kind of operated. And that ended up leading to a lot of people just kind of being the baby boomer generation, if you will. It just ended up making them really, really selfish human beings, right? And of course, when those selfish human beings end up popping kids because of all that free sex and stuff, um, then you have a bunch of neglective parents, right? Now, I've bragged about many times on the streams about like I'm so thankful to God that I'm one of the exceptions, right? That you know my parents did not screw up raising me, but I have seen a many a time of people with really really messed up upbringings because their parents were part of the whole hippie era, and they didn't really raise their kids to be independent people. So now I'm surrounded by people, my peers, if you will, other 30-year-olds that can't do jack shit, right? Like they're pretty incompetent, they're useless, right? And there's a lot of them. They can't hold stable jobs. I mean, I'm not exactly one to talk. As of late, jobs can be tough too, and this is also, you part of it is not just like you know, me not having the most advanced job. But another thing that ends up being a problem is, you know, a lot of people, a lot of the hippie generation didn't raise their kids to be independent, right? So a thing I read on Facebook from time to time, and I was reading this thing on Facebook, and a lot of people think they're being smartasses about this. Oh, hi, Amer. Welcome to the stream. I've read about the 60s, and it's a depressing era. It's really depressing. That's actually what I'm talking about right now, in relation to the book of Judges, as I just read Judges 2. Just go rewind the video. But anyway, um, where was I going with this? Oh, yeah. So I was reading this thing on Facebook, and people like to think they're being really smartasses when they post this. And they talk about how, like, what the school system should be teaching us instead of algebra? School should be teaching us how to take out a loan. A school should be teaching us how to operate our taxes. I'm like, no, the public school is not designed to do that. You know who's supposed to do that? Your parents, right? My parents taught me how to do that shit. I can do that stuff myself, right? I know how to, but my parents taught me how to do that, right? My parents taught me how to make a lot of these decisions of life, like how to make a payment, how to, you know, think about buying a vehicle, right? Stuff like that. All those kind of things that are like life skills, right? The public school is not meant to do that. The public school is meant to you to figure out how to get a functioning job, right? That's the point of a public school. When it comes to how to operate your life, like buying a house down the line in your life, your parents are supposed to teach you that, because your parents should know how to do that. They've done it already, right? That's how you should learn, right? You're supposed to learn from their experience. But one of the things that the hippie era has caused was that parents don't teach their kids this stuff, which then leads to my generation, a generation of basically man children that don't know how to do anything because their parents never taught them. They thought, well, the school might be able to do it. We're too busy having free sex and marijuana, right? And so then you lead to my generation group. And my generation group is just like, well, everybody's useless. We think everybody's useless, right? Because first of all, our parents were pretty much did a shit job raising us. So we think everybody's useless because our parents are useless. And then, you know, useless parents create useless children. So all our peers are useless. So your peers are useless. Your parents are useless. Basically, everybody's useless, right? And so that's our generation now, right? People who are like in their 30s, and if you look at people who are in their 30s, a lot of them are very nihilistic. I admit I have a little bit of nihilistic views as well when I look at other people, my own peers, right? I'm like, God, like, are you shitting me? But you know, the fact of the matter is that is what happened, right? And the 60s played a big part of that. And then of course now you have these same people, the ideologues, uh, the 60s ideologues, and they teach your colleges, which is really dangerous. And I remember like I had to deal with this when I went to college. Oh God, it was a trip and a half, right? Oh God. But anyway, yeah, my undergrad life was shit. That's the best way I can define it. It was pretty awful because of course everyone gave me shit for being a Christian, right? So that was fun. Um, it was not good. And of course now you look at colleges now, and I mean this is from internet videos, so not exactly indicative, but there's a lot of like pushing things that we should have put in the dustbins of like the 20th century, like socialism and stuff like that. But basically, how does that happen, right? And basically, how do you get generations, you know, like the 60s and like my generation, right? How do you get people like this? Well, you get people who forget who God is. That's the short of it. That's Now I know a lot of people say like, well, that's you. That's just you pushing Christian propaganda. But like, you can think in like various parts of. Um, it doesn't have to be quote unquote Christian, but like you look at Japan, and why Japan functions, all right, and why Japan is actually a well functioning place, right? They may not necessarily be Christian, but they keep their religious practices intact, right? They're it's more it's a syncretistic like new Shintoism, but they maintain a lot of the older elements of Shintoism. And one of the advantages, if you will, of the Japanese and their Shinto system is that they don't have a problem incorporating other religious practices like Buddhism and Christianity, actually. Um, Funny story, actually, about that Shintoism has no problem like blending Christianity into its philosophy and its lifestyle. I remember when I was in Japan over a year ago. Wow, it's so weird to think it was like well over a year ago. But anyway, besides the point. When I was in Japan, we were at this hotel, right? We were at the hotel. We were eating dinner. My mom, my aunt, and my cousin. There were four of us, right? So we were eating dinner, and a Christian worship song was just playing, just kind of nonchalant, just like any other program you would have in, um, like for example, you go to a coffee shop, right? Or any restaurant in Vancouver, right? You go to a restaurant, and you're eating. There's gonna be music, background music, right? You have background music. Well, anyway, in this Japanese restaurant, there was playing background music, and you can have all kinds of things. You can have like J-pop. You can have like you know a Japanese ballad type. You just have some instrumental type or whatever, right? Modern instrumental, doesn't matter. And then one of the songs just randomly comes. It was just some worship song in English. It's a worship song in English, and heard this. My mom pointed out like, oh, they're playing like a worship song in here, and I was like, yeah. In Japan, they just do that. And you find that in multiple places. They can just play whatever. All right, thanks for dropping by, Amer. But anyway, they they were just playing a worship song in Japan, and this is not out of the ordinary. This can happen really in a lot of places, right? And the reasoning for this is because in Japan they just kind of like, well, it's music and sounds good enough. We can play it. We have no problem with Christian philosophy and mindset, right? Because in their mind, the Shinto way is that you honor the spirit world. You always honor who God is, right? And sure, many people may have their dice in on who they think God is, right? But in Japan, you don't forget the tradition of the ancestors. You don't forget that. And that is something that operates in Japanese culture, in the bedrock of it. Now, of course, it's not perfect. No such thing as perfect human system. But as Japan utilizes this, they prevent their citizens from buying into nihilistic worldviews, communism and socialism being one of them. In contrast, unfortunately, North America has become extremely nihilistic, and that's why communism and socialism is kind of um, is actually starting to flourish now in North America because we've become a very nihilistic culture, and nihilism comes from basically disregarding the past and the good that it had, right? And now you look at stuff now, we're like burning flags and stuff, taking down statues of historical figures because, oh, this guy was a racist back then. It's like, well, yeah, people were shit back then, but you don't break down a statue because, you know, they were racist. Because in the grand scheme of things, people will do the same thing to us one day. They're gonna look, people in 200 years from now will look at us and be like, man, like, PETA is not at all for animal rights. People in 200 years will look back at PETA and be like, wow, these guys were animal abusers, right? Or like they'll look at like Black Lives Matter 200 years from now. They'll look at Black Lives Matter and go, "Holy shit, this is one of the most racist movements I have ever seen." Right? There's gonna, and this is I can say this from the, I can see it, and it's not even been like that many years, but 200 years, everybody's gonna say that kind of thing, and you could do that, but if you look, contrast with like Japanese culture once again, and why people love it so much. This is why people love Japan, honestly. It's because Japan understands the tradition of the ancestors, and they go, we will always remember the old ways, right? And we will not disregard them. Yes, new things may come in. For example, in Japan, Christianity was a much later thing, imported into Japanese culture. They were like, okay, we can accept this because it doesn't contradict anything we believe. So we can incorporate it, but we will still maintain our older ways as well, right? We can embrace the new, but we don't get rid of the old. And that was something that the Israelites in Book of Judges just didn't do, right? They just disregarded God and then followed the new gods of like Baal, and well, I guess you could argue that Baal is older, but that's besides the point, right? Well, I mean, as far as belief systems are concerned, obviously, right? Because the Canaanites had always been worshiping Baals and Ashtoreth, but that's besides the point. The point is that basically we read in Judges. Now that was a super long tangent, but that's how my brain works. I'm sorry. Anyway, you look at Israel here, right? And that's exactly what happened, right? In a short time, they had disregarded, the moral ethics of their parents' generation, and that quickly just led to all kinds of downward spirals. It was true back then, and it's true now, right? Sure, it's a hot take, and I know a lot of people think, oh no, we're more moral now than we are ever, and that I would be like, are you shitting me, right? I don't know what you're talking about. But anyway, I mean, here's you ready for a mega hot take? I know I shouldn't say these kind of things, especially this one. This one I'm gonna say is actually really offensive. You ready for it? You guys ready for it? But you guys love me for my hot take, so my mom asks me why at the age of 32 I'm not married. You want to know the real reason? You want to know the real reason why I'm not married at the age of 32? Because the truth is, I cannot stand a lot of women in churches today. And you want to know why I can't stand them? The reason why I can't stand them is because so many women in churches today kind of do this. They do this, what I call Christian feminism, and do this, I can have my cake and eat it too, where they expect guys to be, the old-fashioned way of providers and all that stuff, these strong men, whatever, masculine men or whatever, right? But then they also adopt all the feminist ideas that they can just decide what that is, right? Gender is fluid and all that stuff. And so you meet women that like, they don't give you a chance, because if you're not on the outside, you look at a guy like me, pretty regular guy. I'm not huge. I'm actually kind of scrawny, especially in comparison to my height. I look like the freaking Slender Man. Um, I just have a really good camera that I've angled it perfectly so that you don't actually see a good ratio of my height to my my fat level. My fat level is kind of low, and my muscle build is kind of, I'm very thin. I look like friggin' Slender Man. Okay, like I am not an attractive human being in that regard, right? And you know, a lot of women in churches don't give guys, especially Christian guys, chances, because I mean, Christian guys aren't these bloodlusty, aggressive guys, right? And so they don't have attractive guy feeds, which is weird to think about, right? And then, of course, there's other reasons too. There's like purity culture, which is like, once again, it's ridiculous, right? Like, this is where, you know, the whole have your cake and eat it too, where, oh, you know, purity culture is so bad for Christians, but at the same time, a lot of women in churches practice purity culture subconsciously in really stupid ways too. A good example is what we call the side hug. You know, the you hug like the side, the no boob contact, and it's like you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? And then of course girls also like we want to be sexually liberated, and it's like, well, if you're not doing a boob hug, then how are you possibly like okay with your own sexual? And like this baffles my mind, right? And Christian women, lots of them behave with this. I can have my cake and eat it too, and I can't be alone in this, guys. You guys can't stand that shit, right? I mean, I wouldn't exactly call myself an MG toe, but I totally get why MG toe exists. And that's just women in churches. I mean, I guess you could say that makes it worse, but like, you know, in general, it's not just women in churches, but in lots of places too. Although there's some obviously exceptions, right? And I'll tell you a funny story. I told my mom this story. My mom agrees with me that purity culture is just full of crap, but I told this funny story about how like the last time I actually got hugged by a woman that wasn't my mom was by a non-Christian woman. And this was like a couple years ago. I know, I've gone that long without human interaction, right? How am I a sane human being? But like, I made this joke with my mom and I said, you know, when she hugged me, Bree, if you're watching this, when Bree hugged me, she was a friend of, she actually wasn't even like my friend directly. I know Bree like more like she's an acquaintance I saw frequently. Let's call it that way. Bree was a woman that worked with my cousin, um, and my cousin's a hairstylist. So Bree was the last woman that actually gave me a real hug, right? You know, full like hug, right? And this was like a couple years ago, and I made this joke with my mom about how like now I it was like when Christian guys go for non-Christian girls, I thought, yeah, I get it, right? If like you know, because things like human contact is like it's a part of the human experience, right? It doesn't matter if you're Christian or not, right? I mean, in a way, it should be more Christian because Jesus demands that we have this like intimacy, right? God demands that intimacy with us. So who are we to deny each other that, right? Which is part of the problem of my problem with women in churches, right? Is because like, you know, I've always come to believe that God demands you could, I mean, yeah, that's a strong word for it, but I'm gonna use it. God demands that kind of intimacy from us, right? That we should be full hugs with God, you know, figuratively, and you know, when the Lord comes, literally too, right? But the idea is that God demands this level of intimacy. But then here we are in our churches, and we deny each other that. Like, you know how ridiculous this is? It's the stupidest thing, right? It's absurd, and yet it's what's happening in tons of churches, and it's honestly it's killing your churches, guys. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but um, that's what's killing your churches, guys. Mm, mm, I'll leave you with that. You, if you want your church to survive, and you may have to change some of those things, you know, purity culture is killing you. That's one part of it. But anyway, what's this got to do with Book of Judges? I know I'm like hugest. I'm all over the place, but Book of Judges is also like that, so this works great. But the Book of Judges talks about like, yeah, you know, like this is what happens when you forget the way things were, right? And another hot take. This is a lot of concerns of people, like why a lot of Christians are like, you know, anti-mask and all that stuff. And sure, you know, I would wear a mask because you want to be respectful of people, but I get the logic of why a lot of Christians are like, you know, anti COVID protocol. And the idea is that no, we're as God's people, we're supposed to be like out there with the people. Well, it's harder to evangelize. Depends who you are, I guess. It can be harder to evangelize when you're not like in person, right? And then of course, like, you know, what makes the Christian community grow is, you know, contact, being together, intimacy, right? You can't really do that in isolation, right? But oh, I've gone on quite a tirade there, but it goes back to, you know, this kind of idea, you know, the book of Judges is projecting that when we have kind of pushed God, you know, forgot about what God's done in the past and pushed God as kind of like a afterthought, bad things happen, right? And I talked about this with the Ten Commandments once again, why, you know, at the top of the list, you know, worship the Lord your God, and then number 2, don't make idols, right? And so when you worship idols, bad things happen, right? When you disregard God, when you don't worship God, bad things happen, right? And idol building is just the main symptom of that. But bad things happen. And Book of Judges basically is like, yeah, case in point, right? And the funny thing about Judges too is that, yeah, it does exactly that. It tells us like this was an ongoing pattern for the people of Israel, that they had forgotten what God would do. Sure, when things got bad, they would cry out to God in their desperation, which is not how you should have a prayer life, by the way. But they would cry out to God in their desperation, and then God would send a judge to deliver them, and then the good times came, and then the people like, oh, you know, just we're free, we can do whatever we want, which is not the definition of freedom. And then they just did whatever they wanted, and then they forgot about God, and then the bad things would happen, right? And then it's funny where God's like, oh my gosh, I can't stand this. This is idiotic, right? I do want to clarify something in the text though, in Judges 2, because I know a lot of people ask these kind of things about these kind of texts, where you know those moments where God's like, where is it? Oh yeah, so this is in the beginning of Judges 2, where God's talking about how like, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land, but you shall break down their altars, blah, 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 blah. Why have you done this? And I have also said, I will not drive them out before you. They will become traps for you, and their gods will become snares to you. Now, a lot of people over spiritualize these passages, and of course, yours truly's job is to say, guys, you know, don't over spiritualize biblical passages. If you over spiritualize it, you actually miss the point, and then you end up making God say something he doesn't say, right? So when God is talking about how like, oh, I won't drive these people out, they'll become traps for you, and their gods will become snares to you, right? And the idea that like, well, God is gonna leave the people here to tempt Israel, which is crazy because the New Testament says, well, God doesn't tempt people, but rather, it's on one hand, I'm trying to maintain God's consistency as the Bible tells it, because that's what the Bible teaches. But on the other hand, it's actually kind of worse for us, because that means there's more on you, right? And so in this case here, when God says, I will not drive them, the Canaanites, out before you, they will become traps for you, and their gods will become snares to you. So basically what God is actually saying is that, fine, you want to do it this way, you want to just live with these people and expose yourself to what they're going to do, you know, their teaching, their philosophies and whatever, fine, you can have it that way. But don't come crying to me when, you know, you get snared, right? When worshiping their gods gets you in trouble. Don't say I didn't warn you, is what God is saying. Which, yes, now you could make the argument that God is kind of being a little bit douchey here by saying like, fine, you know, but don't come crying to me. But of course, on the other hand, you know, that's God being loving if you think about it, right? Because God allows us to choose, right? God allows us to choose how we want to live our lives. But if if we choose badly and it comes to hurt us, you know, you can't say it's God's fault. You can't be like, "Oh God, why is my life so miserable?" It's like you made your life miserable. You deal with it, right? But isn't God supposed to save us from all these things? Isn't God supposed to make our lives carefree and not worry about these things? And isn't God like, no, the Bible never teaches that. People need to get that out of their heads, right? God isn't a magic 8 ball. He's a person, right? He's got personality. And part of that personality means don't piss him off. Because God will say, like, fine, you know, I don't want to deal with you. And he has every right to do that when you piss him off enough times, right? Of course, God is loving and he will forgive if you repent. But if you're going to willfully, continuously disobey God and then the bad things happen, you can't say, God, it's your fault. God's like, no, don't you dare pin this on me. Don't be a big baby. Own up to your actions. And so, in the context, though, I can see why people over spiritualize this, but the context would suggest that, like, yes, Israel's actions will have massive consequences. Because remember, God is talking from a societal sense, right? What I'm talking about right now is like a more personal sense. When you talk about like your personal choices and you make shitty choices and you have to deal with them. Like, yeah, that's true, right? And on a personal level, like, yeah, it's kind of like duh, right? I have to own up to what I do. But imagine like God has to deal with this on a like a societal level, like the people of Israel. It's not just one guy, right? Like, you know, when we talk about like owning up to our own actions, we're talking about like, you know, us being individuals. And that's obviously important, right? But at the same time, as a society, it's like we got a lot, you know. Do you have to own up to some parts of what happens in your society? I mean, part of it is partly yes, but at the same time, it's like, how do I put this? You know, when you're looking at it from a societal level, and it's like, yeah, we also have like some guilt with that too, right? You know, an example of this is like, okay, like, I mean, people, oh gosh, I can't believe I have to talk about this, but like, you know, in Canada, we have the whole like, well, it's obviously true in the States as well, but like, injustice to like indigenous persons in Canada. I'll use that as an example, right? Now, of course, as a society, yes, we should own some responsibility of that. It's like, okay, like what people did in the past was wrong. Admit that, say that openly. What they did was wrong, right? But at the same time, one, of course, I'm going to turn this around and say, one, stop bringing up the past, right? We're not freaking archaeologists here. We're trying to be ordinary people. Not everybody has to be an archaeologist, so stop digging up the past, right? Why can't we learn to bury the hatchet? Of course, for some people, to bury the hatchet means for all us chinks to leave here because we don't belong here. All the white people need to leave. You know, only indigenous people because they're the real inhabitants, right? There's those people who actually believe that, and that's ridiculous, right? You can't change what is, right? So there's obviously two sides of it, but when God is talking about here, you know, on a people owning their sin as a society, it's like, yeah, you're gonna have to, right? And you're gonna have to deal with the consequences as a society, and we're facing that right now in 2021, right? I just used the uh, indigenous justice cases as an example, and it had at the same time there are limits, and I think people are over pushing those limits. But at the same time, it's like, okay, there were things that we did in the past that were wrong, right? Like, yeah, we have to admit that. And in the same way, God is saying that, like, yeah, you better, if you're going to do things and it comes to bite you as a society, you're going to have to admit that you did it, right? It's not my fault, right? Because God is not taking up responsibility for your evil actions, right? But of course, unfortunately, many people, many anti-Christians, I should say non-Christian, that's not accurate. Many anti-Christians will use that kind of logic, right? They'll say, well, it was your religion, it was your God that did it, right? And so they try to put the blame on God for people's evil, right? But it's like, no, you can't pin it on God, which is exactly what God is saying in the book of Judges. It's like, look, you're going to do bad things. And he's talking to the people of Israel, right? His covenant people. You can do bad things. You can't pin it on me, right? And so that's what the passage is actually saying, right? He's not saying that God is going to, allow evil to fester, but rather he's saying that when evil does happen, you cannot ever say it is my fault. You're the ones who let their gods be snares. You're the ones who allowed the Canaanites to seduce you, and you have to own up to that. Can't believe I've talked this much, and it's only been like 2 chapters. But don't worry, the book of Judges is overall it's not that long. I had a lot of hot takes for Judges 2, but Judges 2 is just full of hot takes, so I guess you just take it and go. And I think I might as well kind of tell this when I was deliberating in my head whether like I was going to do Judges or I was going to do Samuel, because Samuel is, both of them have a lot of really great applications to the world we live in today, and that was why I wanted to pick one of those two, right? But I think when I was praying about it and I thought about like, you know what, I'm gonna pick the book of Judges, and the reason was because like there were just too many instances I could think of, and as you watch future streams, I'm definitely gonna keep bringing them up. There's a lot of cases where like stuff happens in the book of Judges, and you look at it and you go, we have not changed very much in a few thousand years, have we, humans? Right? We're still pretty much just as awful and idiotic as the Israelites were in the book of Judges. We're not that different, right? But of course, the empathy moment should be that maybe because we're not that different, one, we shouldn't be so hard to judge each other, but secondly, it is all the more reason we need to look to Christ to change our lives and to fix our heart conditions and all that, right? Because yeah, we're not that different from all these awful people we read about, as we're about to read more of in the book of Judges. Well, the next few chapters actually has hero stories, so that's always fun. And then let's go on the last parts of the stream on a good note. Let's read some hero stories, shall we? So that's my long tangent for chapter 2, but let's continue on with Judges chapter 3. So these are the nations the Lord left to test all those Israelites who had not experienced any of the wars in Canaan. He did this only to teach warfare to the descendants of the Israelites who had not had previous battle experience. So the 5 rulers of the Philistines, all the Canaanites, Sidonites, and Hivites living in Lebanon mountains, from Mount Baal Hermon to Lebo Hamath, they were left to test the Israelites, to see whether they would obey the Lord's commands, which he had given to their ancestors through Moses. So the Israelites lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. Basically, though, really? Really, Israel? Really? It's one of those moments. Don't worry, you get a lot of those in the book of Judges. Verse 7. So the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Of course they did. And they forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he sold them into the lands of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram-Naharaim, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. The Spirit of the Lord came on him, so that he became Israel's judge, and went to war. The Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. So the land had peace for 40 years, until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. I'm gonna have a drink. Verse 12. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Get used to this. And because they did this evil, the Lord gave Eglon, king of Moab, power over Israel, getting the Ammonites and Amalekites to join him. Eglon came and attacked Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. The Israelites were subject to Elon, king of Moab, for 18 years. Again, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he gave them a deliverer, Ehud, a sinister man, the son of Gera the Benjamite. The Israelites sent him with tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Ehud had made a double-edged sword about a cubit long, which he strapped to his right thigh under his clothing. He presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, who was a very fat man. So after Ehud had presented the tribute, he sent on their way those who had carried it. But on reaching the stone images near Gilgal, he himself went back to Eglon and said, Your Majesty, I have a secret message for you. And the king said to his attendants, Leave us. Or sorry, if he's a fat man, I gotta do the voice. You ready for the fat man voice? Leave us. And they left. Ehud then approached him while he was sitting alone in the upper room of his palace and said, I have a secret message from God for you. And as the king rose from his seat, Ehud reached with his left hand, drew the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. Even the handle sank in after the blade, and his bowels discharged. Ehud did not pull the sword out, and the fat closed in over it. He's gotta be mega fat. I mean, if you eat the guy's like cubits, anyway, I'll talk about more of that later. Then Ehud went out of the porch. He shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked them. After Ehud had gone, the servants came and found the doors of the upper room locked. And they said, he must be relieving himself in the inner room of the palace. They waited to the point of embarrassment, but when he did not open the doors of the room, they took a key and unlocked them. There they saw their lord fallen to the floor, dead. So while they waited, Ehud got away, and he passed by the stone images and escaped to Serah. Serah is Sirah. When he arrived there, he blew a trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hills, with him leading them. Follow me, he ordered, for the Lord has given Moab, your enemies, into your hands. So they followed him down and took possession of the fords of the Jordan that led to Moab. They allowed no one to cross over. At that time they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all vigorous and strong. No one escaped. That day Moab was made subject to Israel, and the land had peace for 80 years. After Ehud came Shamgar, son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad, and he too saved Israel. So chapter 3 gave us 3 judges. 2 of them had short stories, and one of them was really a lot longer, but it's still pretty short. So chapter 3, first we had Othniel. So Othniel, obviously the first one, because he's still within like the generations, if you will, the immediate generations of like, Joshua, right? Because Othniel is the son of Caleb? Or is he his grandson? Let me check that again. Othniel is Othniel is Caleb's nephew. So I need to bring up who Caleb was. Caleb was basically a peer of Joshua. Uh, Basically, when Caleb and Joshua were younger, they were the few of Israel who believed they could have conquered Canaan when God first gave them the order. Because they believed, God allowed them to survive the 40 years walking in the desert. So, with that being said, though, if Kenaz is Caleb's younger brother, then, this is still only like a generation away, right? So, when we talk about like back in Judges 2 about like within one generation, Israel forgot what God did and did evil, blah blah blah, right? So basically, the Othniel story tells us that yeah, God straight up just allowed the first group of attackers basically immediately, right? He didn't even give like the next generation a break, right? To allow their evil to fester. It's just like, oh, fine, here these guys are. They're ready to fight you because they see you're useless, right? And so Othniel is an interesting um, side story just to kind of point out that, like, yeah, the troubles for Israel basically began immediately. This is important to keep in mind because that's kind of how not just Israel's history, but like our spiritual lives can be at times, right? When we sway away from God and begin our disobedience, then yeah, the troubles can come almost immediately, and they will catch you, right, from right under your nose. And I mean, I've seen that kind of thing happen in people's lives, and it does happen that way, right? It's like right after, it's an immediate. It can be an immediate thing, and that's definitely true here, right? With the story of Othniel. Othniel is part of the next generation, right? And so he's part of the first generation of people just immediately disobeying God, right? And it's interesting to think that, right, that this just happens the way that it does, and the Bible makes a note to point this out. That yeah, the troubles will come right away when you disobey God. Excuse me. Then we have Ehud. Well, Ehud has a longer story because I'm pretty sure when they were compiling the story, they're like, man, Ehud is such a badass. We gotta put like more to this guy. We gotta put the whole thing in, right? The whole news article, if you will, right? We're gonna put the whole thing in because clearly Ehud is awesome, and so he's an interesting character, right? He acts like an assassin, and the funny thing is that the Bible describes him as sinister, but ironically, um, we use that word nowadays to talk about like, oh, it's like a really evil person, but the the word sinister actually just means like the offhanded, and so which when you say offhand, like is your not dominant weapon hand, right? It's a military word actually. The word sinister. It's a person who fights with their offhand because your weapon hand is usually your right hand because most people are right-handed, right? So it's called your weapon hand or your main hand. Anyone who plays fantasy video games knows this, right? Because that's how they refer to your weapon junctions, right? You have your main hand and your offhand, and so um, when Ehud is referred to as sinister, it means he fights with the offhanded weapon. He uses weapons on his offhand, which means he's left-handed. Modern translations of Bibles just say he's left-handed, but I like using the word sinister just because it sounds awesome. And I'm pretty sure when like the older, when they compiled the stories together, and they're like, oh man, this guy's awesome, right? He's the guy who fights with, he's sinister, right? He fights with his offhand. He's clearly awesome. And then of course he does like this epic assassination moment, right? So like clearly Ehud is awesome. I remember when I first heard the story of Ehud, and it's just like, man, this guy's awesome. But he only has like these like what, uh, like 18, 19 verses. That's it. That's all this guy gets. But the Bible did a good job to make him awesome in like these passages. So basically, He fights this guy called Eglon, and Eglon's like this really fat dude. I love how the Bible is also like this dude was so fat that you could shove a cubit sword. So how big is a cubit? Cubit sword is not a cubit sword is like what we would call a short sword. It's not that long. It's not like a full length sword. I'm trying to think of like, do I have a cubit sword somewhere? I'm pretty sure I have one somewhere. I have an actual regular sword, but a cubit sword would. I don't have a lot of short ones. I just have like more regular swords, like broadswords and stuff. But a cubit would have been about like this long. So like my arm length is a little bit longer than a cubit. I have kind of long arms. Um, if you cut off my fingers, but please don't. Um, so let me just try and angle this with my camera better. From my elbow to my knuckle here, that I've posted that you can see on screen. So from my elbow to about here, that's about a cubit. So that's how long the blade would be on this sword. So imagine like a blade like that inside, like into a fat dude. Like this guy's so fat, right? That you could fit this whole blade into his belly. Because let's be real, if you stand me with a blade, like you only need like, I'm a pretty thin guy, so like, just to put a blade through me, the blade only has to be like, let's say like half that length, right? A 9-inch blade could basically go through me. I'm a really thin guy, maybe a little bit longer than let's say 9-inch blade. So your typical machete, right, could go through me. But this Eglon guy is so fat that a cubit blade did not even go through. I'm just checking my measurements again. Maybe a cubit does actually include my fingers. I don't know. Cubit is not like a long sword. It's a short sword, but I mean, um, yeah, I guess it worked, and he managed to plunge the whole thing, and then you have to include the handle. So who knows? The handle's probably like an extra like 4 or 5 inches, right? Typical short sword handles are about like 4 inches. They're not that long. About 4 or 5 inches, something like that. So you have to basically like 2 feet once you put the handle in there as well. That Ehud shoved a 2-foot object into this guy's belly, and it just went like, and it actually stayed inside the guy concealed because his fat rolled over the handle, which has got to be kind of nasty too. You think about it, it's like, oh man, like this guy's like flubber and it's gross. He's just that fat. Anything else to say about Mr. Sinister over here? So, Ehud. The funny thing is when people like look at the story, it's like, wait, how would hiding a blade on your right side do anything, right? Like, wouldn't people search you? Well, back then, I guess they don't do searches like we as modern smarter people do, right? We don't do full pat down. They don't do full pat downs, and they obviously don't have metal detectors. It's funny. You ever see like in those movies? It's like it looks really ridiculous. Like the movies do it to look badass, but at the same time, it's kind of ridiculous of how this is how they search people. So like, you ever watch it like in those movies where a guy's about to walk into a place, right? He's got his trench coat or whatever, right? And as he walks in, he just pulls out like the one side of his trench coat, like his left side, and then like there's nothing, right? So to show he has no weapon, right? Or when a guy is intimidating someone, you ever seen like the original Ninja Turtles? That's a good example of this, right? Raphael is out in the streets of New York and he catches these 2 punks that are trying to steal this woman's purse, right? And the guys are gonna get up and they're gonna fight Raphael, right? But Raphael, he opens his coat on his left side and he shows that he's got a side there, right? And he basically is his way of telling him, like, don't screw with me, right? Like, I'm armed, I have a weapon, and I'm gonna use it if you fight me, right? So like, Raphael does the thing where he like opens his trench coat on one side. He only has to show the one side. Now it's safe to assume that he probably has a weapon on his other side, right? Or it doesn't matter if he has a weapon on his other side, right? Of course, like nowadays we've changed that, right? But in movies like that, they do it to try to look badass. But like at the same time in real life, that's not how you search somebody. Because that's probably how like Ehud entered, right? Like everybody would enter the guy's kingdom. They just open the left side. Oh, no weapon, no weapon, no weapon. Nobody goes, hey, can I check the other side? But ancient world customs were not as, they didn't think things through like we do, right? This is also why like the police belts are built the way they are, because you can't conceal it. It's the way that a cop shows that, like, you know, he one is a cop, and that um, he is armed to protect the people, because like he has a big ass belt, and then of course his gun is there, right? But anyway, of course it's not gun, so a gun would be on the same side, right? You when you pull a gun, you would pull it from a right hand. If you're right-handed, you pull a gun, you pull on the right side, right? But a sword is different, right? And you see it in like all those movies, right? The guy either, well, most of the time, because realistically, people don't put sword scabbards on their back. It's always on the left side, right? And they pull a sword across this way, right? Because that's how, you know, you pull a sword and you're like this, right? You don't pull a sword. You don't pull a sword from your right side and then like the blade is down here, right? And you know, it's not like those. It's not like a modern video game where like some guys are like being super badass. I fight with my sword back here, right? Like no one does that, right? So that's why the sword, Ehud's sword, would have been on his right side, but nobody would bother to check the right side because ancient world people are weird like that. But of course, you know, nobody would have thought the ambidextry was a thing, right? And of course, you know, long before, you know, Salem witch hunt, long before Salem witch hunts. Wow, I can't talk. Long before Salem witch hunts, you know, people were like, you would be viewed as like, you know, a witch or something if you were like left-handed, because oh no, the normal way is everybody's right-handed, right? But I mean, nowadays you don't care about that stuff, right? I mean, it's a cool skill if you can use your left hand, right? Funny thing, the other day, I was like, my brother's trying to lift weights again, you know, get his strength back up, and so I was lifting some weights with him, and it's like I was lifting a 10 with my left arm. Yeah, this is how bad I am, okay? I'm like, man, it actually takes a fair amount of work to do like the 10 pound with my left arm. And my right arm, no problem. My right arm's pretty good. Right? But I always make jokes like, left hand, you got a free ride in life. Because I'm like really dominantly right-handed. Like I do everything. I do all that stuff. Like any sport, right hand. And I don't use my left hand as much as I should. But Ehud had a great skill, and it clearly worked for this assassination attempt. I like how the story has a funny detail about like, oh yeah, the guards were like, oh, he's probably relieving himself. Maybe we should leave him alone. And then the bot was like, well, they waited until it was embarrassing. So like, how long would that have been? Like half an hour, maybe an hour. I mean, who? I don't know if you could be in the bathroom for over half an hour like that. You know, unless you got like, I mean, Eglon was a majorly fat man, so who knew what kind of runs he had? No one wants to think about it. I just kind of scarred all your minds right there, didn't I? But yeah, and I like how the Bible just points out like, yeah, these guards are just like, should we go in there? I don't know. It's kind of he's been in there for a long time. And he just kept waiting. I don't know. I thought that was funny. Finally, we have Shamgar, who literally he has one verse. Yeah, one verse for a judge. You gotta say, man, this Shamgar guy got like the short end of the stick. After we just had this awesome story of Ehud and how much of a badass he is. I mean, they try to make Shamgar look awesome. He kills like what, 600 guys with an ox goad? Basically a giant plank of wood. Well, an ox goad would be like, how do I put it? I'll show you what an ox goad is. It's better if I show you what an ox goad is than to explain it. An ox goad. Like you've seen one before. I'm sure you've seen what an ox goad is. Image. I'm trying to look for. I was just looking at images of an ox goad, and apparently there's a gun called the ox goad. The ox goad gun is a semi-automatic rifle. It's an assault rifle. Anyway, a real ox goad. This is what an ox goad looks like. Put image in new tab. Just to show you what an ox goad looks like. Capture display. There you go. This is an ox goad. An ox goad is a disciplinary item that you use on, well, oxen obviously. So yeah, it's basically. I wish this picture was better than just the image itself. An ox goad is like. I mean, we use similar like things with like the whip thingy for horses. What do you call those things? Like that jockeys use for like horses. The ox goad is just a little bit longer than that, so it's probably like 2 feet, maybe 2.5 feet. It's about like 2, let's say 2.5 feet. That nice middle ground, right? I don't think it's quite 3 feet. That'd be pretty long. It's not, yeah, it's not like a meter. It's just under that. So it'd be like 2.5 feet, something like that. Anyway, yeah, that's the ox goad. And apparently there was a dude, this Shamgar guy, straight up fights 600 guys with an ox goad, which that has got to be the most durable ox goad I have ever seen. Because that's hilarious. It's just like, yeah, he's gonna whack you guys to death with this thing. It's not like a sword or a high quality bladed weapon. It's a farming tool, right? And this guy just straight up like, yeah, I'm gonna fight 600 guys with this thing. Although the Bible doesn't say that he did all this in one fight. Probably not. After all, the only guy that's like said to fight like a large number of guys at one time is Samson, and we'll get to him eventually. He's like near the end of the book of Judges, but like Samuel's probably the only guy who like fights a large number of guys by himself. But still, if you have an ox goad that has a kill count of 600 guys, it's pretty badass. So there, chapter 3 gave you a story of 3 judges. Now I'm just looking here, and I don't know if I want to do the Deborah story in one stream. I might want to save Deborah and Gideon. Deborah and Gideon are back to back, so. Oh, but Gideon's is so long, isn't it? Yeah, it's really long. Gideon's is really long. You know what? We will do Deborah today, and then we'll end the stream. And Deborah's a pretty great story. And the only reason why I was hesitant to do Deborah at first was because chapter 5, which is like the Song of Debra, which is basically a repeat of chapter 4 but put in song form, which I am not singing for you. Because one, I wouldn't know what kind of style it would be. Secondly, my singing voice sucks. So yeah, we're not doing that. So chapter 5 will be a little bit redundant. So I'll just kind of do the whole commentary of Deborah kind of together. So anyway, let's just read chapter 4 and then we'll end the stream. Or chapter 4 and 5 and we'll end the stream. Alright, so again, the Israelites did evil. Chapter 4. So again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now that Ehud was dead, so the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin. I think that's how you say that. Or is it Yabin? I'm going to say Yabin. I think it's Yabin. Yabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor Sisera. The commander of his army was based in Harosheth Haggoyim. Because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had truly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. They cried out to the Lord for help. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at the time. And she held court under the palm of Deborah, between Ramah or Ramah It's totally pronounced Ramah. Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites went up to her and to have their disputes decided. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kedesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands." Now Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go, but if you do not go with me, I won't go." "Certainly, I will go with you," said Deborah, "but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went under his command. Deborah also went up with him. Now Heber the Kenite had left the other Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and pitched his tent by the great tree in Zenanim, near Kadesh. When they told Sisera that Barak son of Abinoam had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera summoned from Harosheth Hagoyim to the Kishon River, and all his men and his 900 chariots fitted with iron. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" Sorry, my phone just went off. Where was I? Oh, yes. So Barak went down to Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. Verse 15. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled by foot. Now Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all Sisera's troops fell by the sword. Not a man was left. Sisera, meanwhile, fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there was an alliance between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the family of Heber the Kenite. Now Jael went out to meet Sisera, and said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. "I'm thirsty," he said. "Please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk, and gave him a drink, and covered him up. "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he told her. "If someone comes by you and asks you, 'Is anyone in there?' say no." But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer, and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. It's pretty badass. But then Barak came in by pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him. "Come," she said, "I will show you the man you're looking for." So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his head, dead. I mean, I'm pretty sure if you had a tent peg driven through your head, you would be deader than dead. Now on that day, God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, before the Israelites. And the hand of the Israelites pressed harder and harder against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they destroyed him. Okay, yeah, so I'm going to talk about chapter 4 and a little bit of chapter 5, because chapter 5 just retells chapter 4 in song form. So basically, we are introduced to the judge Deborah. And the funny thing is that Deborah doesn't do all that much. She's kind of like the ultimate moral support, I guess. Because she's like, I don't have to do anything, but if you want my help, I guess I'll show up anyway. And help out. But Deborah, yeah, not much really happens. The Israelites are fighting this one guy along with the king of who? The Canaanites? Yeah. Yabin is king of the Canaanites, right? Just check that again. Yeah, he's king of Canaan. So he's king of the Canaanites. And of course, we have Deborah. Now, even though, like, on the one hand, you're like, wow, a woman judge, she's going to be awesome, right? But on the other hand, it's kind of like, she doesn't really want to do much. She's more like, oh, I just handle the state's affairs. I'm not really the combat type. Which is very different from like when you read the three other judges before her, and these guys were all like badass fighters. But I mean, Deborah is just case in point that there's more than one way to be awesome, right? And it's that she's a person who's truly faithful to the commands of God, which is far more powerful, right, than being a badass sword fighter. But with Deborah's faithfulness, like God allows her to see the future, right? And that's why she's a prophetess, right? God allows her to see the future, and it's funny when she tells Barak, where Barak's kind of being a chicken, and is like, "Look, God says you're gonna win. Like, just go." And then Barak's like, "Oh, but only if you go with me." And Deborah's like, "Fine, but just so you're not gonna get the glory for what's gonna happen, right? Like, God will deliver our enemy into the hands of a woman." And so, from a writing standpoint, when they were writing this, I'm sure, or compiling the news headlines, if you want to use that analogy more, I'm going to keep using it. So they're compiling the headlines. They're like, wow, this is a pretty awesome story, and also tell like a story of a woman. The woman judge being awesome. We got to include it in the analogs. So yeah, Deborah was kind of added, but the funny thing is like all she does is just tell Barak what to do. So I mean, Deborah's in my mind, she's not the more awesome character. In my mind, Jael is the awesome character in this story, and she's only got like a few passages. But Jael is the ultimate example of if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. That's Jael in a nutshell, right? If it looks too good to be true, it probably is. Because okay, so you gotta look at this from Sisera's point of view, right? So Sisera, his men just got their asses handed to them, right? You know, Barak is routing his guys, all his guys are getting killed, right? And so Sisera is just running for his life. And he runs up to this tent and this hot girl comes out. I assume Jael's hot. Um I'm gonna assume she is. Um I gave her the seductress voice because I mean it only works better. So I'm gonna assume she's hot. So anyway, Jael comes out of this tent, right? A woman comes out of her tent to meet you, all right? If you're a guy running for your life, the last thing you should be looking at is a woman coming out of her tent. All right? You should be running for your life. And you should keep running is what Sisera should have done if he wanted to live. So obviously, when Jael comes out of the tent to meet him, she's already got you, buddy. So anyway, she comes out of the tent. She's just like, "Oh, you want to come into my tent? Look, guys, if it looks too good to be true, it probably is, right?" And I mean, the Bible has a lot of passages of exactly that, right? You gotta be wary when someone tries to seduce you into their home, you know, unconditionally. You you always gotta be wary about stuff like that because if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. She lets him into the tent and she's just like, "Oh, here's a blanket. Oh, you like something to drink?" Like, guy, like this, like Sisera. Part of it may have been exhaustion, but not the smartest moves on this guy, right? A pretty woman lets you into her tent, gives you a nice warm drink. You gotta know something's up. Like, come on, guys. Like, something's up. Sisera too stupid to know what's up, though, and that basically he's gonna die very soon. As stupid, that tends to happen to the stupid, right? The fool is the first one to fall. But, you know, he should have seen this coming, right? I mean, if you play any, like, maybe this is just me being the hardcore gamer, but if you play any, like, any RPG and the attractive girl comes out and wants you to come to her house, you know, something's up. I mean, I still make this joke about, like, what was it, Tuesday, when I was playing Bravely Default, and then there's the part where you meet this girl. She's like the guardian of this ancient dragon, right? And she's like, "Hey, you guys want to stay over? It's been a lot. It's been a while since I've had anyone stay over, and it'd be nice to have a big, strong man like you." And you're just like, you know where this is going, right? Like, she's being all like cute about it, and she's like, "Let's fight." It's like, yes, of course she wants to fight. It's exactly what she wants to do, right? I mean, if it looks too good to be true, guys, it probably is. Like, come on, like you should have seen this coming, right? And jail is, you know, no exception to the rule. I mean, you may argue she may even be the archetype. Well, no, not really. I'm pretty sure there's like lots of stories of these kind of things, right? I mean, it's a whole funny narrative trope, right? If it looks too good to be true, it probably is, you know. And the Bible even tells you in like the book of Proverbs, be careful of the woman trying to lull you into her home. Death awaits you. And in Sisera's case, quite literally, with a tent peg through the head, which has got to be one embarrassing way to go. So, but at the same time, serves you right. It's what you get for not paying attention. Clearly, this is what happens when you don't play video games. You get caught by stuff like this. See, if I was Cesaro and I saw Jail come out of her tent saying, "Hey, you want to come in?" No, I would have known to keep running. Of course, then I'd probably get shot in the back, but that'd be beside the point. Better that than to have a tent peg drilled through my head while I was sleeping. So, you gotta weigh your options here. But at the same time, I think Jail is pretty badass. I actually really like her because of this little excerpt. It's great. Jail's the real hero of this story. Just say it. Even though, yes, the next chapter, which we will end the stream with, is called the Song of Debra. Jail is still the star character because, let's be honest, Jail is pretty great. That's a real biblical woman for you right there. Alright, chapter 5. On that day, Deborah and Barak, son of Abinoam, sang this song, which I will just read to you and not sing it. When the princes in Israel take the lead, when the people willingly offer themselves, praise the Lord. Hear this, you kings, listen, you rulers. I, even I, will sing to the Lord. I will praise the Lord, the God of Israel, in song. When you, Lord, went out from Seir, when you marched from the land of Edom, the earth shook, the heavens poured, the clouds poured down water. The mountains quaked before the Lord, the one of Sinai, before the Lord, the God of Israel. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were abandoned. Travelers took to winding paths. Villagers in Israel would not fight. They held back until I, Deborah, arose, until I arose, a mother in Israel. God chose new leaders when war came to the city gates, but not a shield or spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. My heart is with Israel's princes, with the willing volunteers among the people. Praise the Lord. You who ride on white donkeys, sitting on your saddle blankets, and you who walk along the road, consider the voice of the singers at the watering places. They recite the victories of the Lord, the victories of his villagers in Israel. Then the people of the Lord went down to the city gates. Wake up, Deborah. Wake up, and break out in song. Arise, Barak, take captives your captives, son of Abinoam. The remnant of the nobles came down. The people of the Lord came down to me against the mighty. Some came from Ephraim, whose root was in Amalek. Benjamin was with you, the people who followed. From Machir, captains came down. From Zebulun, those who bear a commander's staff. The princes of Issachar were with Deborah. Yes, Issachar was with Barak, set under his command into the valley. Excuse me, whoa. Let me read that again. The princes of Issachar were with Deborah. Yes, Issachar was with Barak, set under his command into the valley. In the districts of Reuben, there was much searching of heart. Why did you stay among the sheep pens, to hear the whistling for the flocks? In the districts of Reuben, there was much searching of heart. Gilead stayed behind the Jordan, and Dan, why did he linger by the ships? Asher remained on the coast and stayed in his coves. The people of Zebulun risked their very lives, and so did Naphtali on the terrace fields. Kings came, kings fought, the kings of Canaan fought. At Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo, they took no plunder of silver. From the heavens the stars fought, from their courses they fought against Sisera. The river Kishon swept away, the age-old river, the river Kishon. March on, my soul, and be strong. Then thundered the horses' hooves. Galloping, galloping go his mighty steeds. Curse Meroz, said the angel of the Lord. Curse its people bitterly, because they did not come to help the Lord against the mighty. But most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, the most blessed of tent-dwelling women. He asked for water, and she gave him milk. In a bowl fit for nobles, she brought him curdled milk. Her hand reached for the tent peg, her right hand for the workman's hammer. She struck Sisera, she crushed his head, and she shattered and pierced his temple. At her feet he sank, he fell, and there he lay. And at her feet he sank, he fell, and where he sank, there he fell, dead. And through the window peered Sisera's mother. Behind the lattice she cried out, Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why is the clatter of his chariots delayed? The wisest of her ladies answered her, Indeed, she keeps saying to herself, Are they not finding and dividing the spoils? A woman or two for each man, colorful garments as plunder for Sisera, colorful garments embroidered, highly embroidered garments for my neck, all this as plunder. So may all your enemies perish, Lord, but may all who love you be like the sun. When it rises in its strength, then the land had peace for 40 years. And that is the Song of Debra, which is really more about Jael, because Jael was awesome. And the ending part of the poem / song is just like the most ironic thing, right? Where the story obviously tells that like Jael pegged him, literally, in the head. And then the ending of the story is kind of like this weird, like, the perspective of Sisera's mother saying, Where is my son? And saying like, well, he's probably off plundering women. Which is really messed up if you think about it. If women are telling a guy's mom that her son is off having his way with women. But the irony is that it was a woman who had her way with him by killing him. So it's kind of like the weirdest song. The Song of Debra is just so bizarre, but it's so funny to read when you put those things in consideration. Anyway, With Chapter 5, there's not much else to say about it because anything I would have said, I already said it with Chapter 4. So, with that said, though, this is going to be... Oh, this is going to be the end of the stream. Missy, don't fidget, Miss you. Just say bye to everybody when it's time, okay? Anyway, this is going to be the end of the stream. I'm going to end it here. Just a bit of housekeeping, though, before we officially close. I will do a makeup stream tomorrow because I didn't stream on Wednesday because of funny stuff that happened. Really, like, after Tuesday night, my mom was like, hey, I want to use your computer to do a Zoom call with your nephew. And I was like, okay. He's like, yeah, your nephew, Marcus is his name, he's going to read to us, or read to me. And I'm like, okay, what time? She's like, 3 o'clock. I'm like, that's when I stream, but I guess I'll cancel the stream so my mom can have Zoom time with my nephew. So because of that, I will do a makeup stream on Saturday. I'm trying not to make like Saturday streams a habit though. So hopefully after tomorrow we won't have to deal with that too often. But with that said, tomorrow we'll stream at 2 o'clock, maybe 3 if I you know, it might be a little later, right? 3 would be the later time. If I can make it back early tomorrow, then we'll do it at 2. If I don't make it back, then we'll just wait till 3 o'clock. And then hopefully next week we can just do a regular week. Monday to Thursday, Bravely Default. Friday, we'll continue the Book of Judges. That's the plan. Lord willing, we're going to keep it that way, right? We'll see. But with that said, this is going to be the end of the stream. Missy, come on. Be more cooperative. Say bye to everybody. Say bye. No, see, she's like, no. I'm not saying bye. The cat doesn't want to talk to you people. Sorry, guys. Anyway, this is going to be the end of the stream. I hope you guys enjoyed the Book of Judges and all my hot takes, because let's be real, the Book of Judges is nothing but hot takes. I mean, it's all the hot news lines of that time, so I mean, of course they're going to have hot takes in it. But anyway, this is going to be the end. I hope you guys enjoyed the Book of Judges. I will see you guys tomorrow for Bravely Default, as well as the first 4 days of next week. Well, Monday to Thursday. So basically 5 Bravely Default streams in a row. Because Saturday will be a makeup, and then we'll do our 4 regular ones next week. And then we will be reading more Judges next Friday at 3 o'clock. Hope you guys have a great weekend. Hope you guys have a great rest of your night. And God bless you. Have a good one.